The Force is old and full of shadows.
The negotiator hung above Coruscant like a hawk watching something die. The Battle of Coruscant was burning toward its conclusion in the upper atmosphere. Chancellor Palpatine had been rescued from the invisible hand an hour ago, at tremendous cost, by the skin of 2 Jedi's teeth. But the Separatist fleet had not received the news with the intended demoralization. Capital ships still exchanged volleys across dark space. Starfighters still threaded between burning hulks. The distant flower blooms of detonating munitions still painted the stratosphere in shades of orange and gold that might have been beautiful, in another context, to a person with room for beauty. By any historical measure, this was the largest space battle ever fought above a single world. Civilizations turn on moments like this one. Everything that follows gets divided into before and after. In a small meditation chamber 3 decks below the negotiator's command bridge, General Obi-Wan Kenobi was very, very still. He sat in the Jedi way, legs folded, hands loose on his knees, spine straight as a temple pillar, eyes closed. To any observer, he would have appeared to be resting. To anyone with the sensitivity to feel the Force, he appeared as a stone dropped into the center of a dark lake, ripples running not outward, but inward. He was sinking, going somewhere the body cannot follow. At 38, Obi-Wan Kenobi was considered among the most accomplished Jedi masters of his era. 3 years of the Clone Wars had carved new lines into his face and given his eyes the weight of command, the particular weight of a man who has sent soldiers to their deaths while keeping his voice perfectly steady, who has outwitted battle droids and Sith assassins and entire planetary blockades with equal composure. Always with that slight upward curl at the corner of his mouth, suggesting he saw this particular move 3 plays ago and is simply waiting for the universe to catch up. They called him the Negotiator, the Cunning, the Obi-Wan of 10,000 plans. He was not reaching for any plan right now. He was reaching for Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon Jinn's presence in the Force first arrived months ago, not as words, just warmth. Sunlight on cold stone. In the hours stolen between battles, they had been meeting across the veil, the old master patient beyond patience, teaching Obi-Wan a form of living Force communion that had no name in the archives. Complete dissolution of self-attachment. Until the will of the Force flows through rather than merely alongside. Not around you, Qui-Gon had said. Through, the distinction had taken 6 weeks to feel rather than simply understand. The last time they touched across the veil, Qui-Gon had said, "Something is coming. Something that will require more than your skill. It will require your wisdom." "I'm not wise," Obi-Wan had replied. "I'm experienced. There is a difference." "Not," Qui-Gon had said for much longer. He had not understood it then. Now, sinking deeper into the living current of the Force than he had ever gone, returning to the Negotiator after the rescue, the battle winding down around him, the adrenaline of the invisible hand finally ebbing, he began to understand. It came not as a vision but as weight, a second consciousness pressing against his own the way a ship presses against a docking clamp. Enormous, insistent, somehow, impossibly his, it carried the smell of desert sand and the cold silence of twin moons rising. It carried calluses he did not yet have, and the particular grief that only 19 years of absolute solitude can carve into a man's bones. It carried the sound a boy makes when he doesn't know he's being watched, and what it costs, across 19 years, to watch and never speak. It carried the knowledge of everything that was about to happen. He saw the temple burning. He saw his own hands on a security hologram's controls in the dead of night, rewinding the footage, finding what was on it. He felt the weight of stepping over small shapes on cold stone floors. He felt Mustafar, the heat, the volcanic ash, the moment he stood at the top of that terrible embankment and screamed words that cost him everything to say. Words he spent 19 years trying to unsay in the silence of the desert. He felt the years themselves, the sand, the wind, the twin suns that never once asked anything of him, except that he be present to receive their light. He felt the slow, accumulative process of a man becoming more than the sum of what happened to him. He felt the moment on the Death Star when he looked across a hangar at a boy with his best friend's eyes and understood, with the certainty of someone who has finally made peace with the shape of his story, that his sacrifice would mean something. that this was not an ending. He felt himself die. And then, he felt himself breathe. Here now 38 years old, aboard the Negotiator, above Coruscant, the battle still winding down outside, all of it still possible to prevent. General Obi-Wan Kenobi opened his eyes. For a long moment, he simply sat. Two men, the same man, separated by 2 decades of grief and survival and the slow accumulation of wisdom, underwent the process of becoming one. He did not rush it. He had never been able to rush anything that mattered, and 19 years in a desert confirmed that this was not a failing. Then, he rose. Not running. Running would not have been him, either version of him. He walked, at exactly the measured pace of a man with a plan he had had decades to refine, to the nearest comm panel. "Where is Skywalker?" The bridge officer responded in seconds. Anakin Skywalker had been seen entering the High Council chamber alone, approximately 12 minutes ago, returned from the Invisible Hand landing, heading directly for the temple. He had not emerged. "Thank you," Obi-Wan said. He walked. The temple's deeper corridors carried a silence no other place in the galaxy produced. Not the silence of emptiness, but of accumulation. Thousands of years of meditation, of prayer, of countless beings practicing faithfulness to something larger than themselves. The floors held the warmth of it. Even now, with a battle finishing in the sky above, and the Republic balanced on a knife's edge, the temple breathed. Obi-Wan walked through it and looked at the clone troopers at their posts. For the first time in 3 years of fighting alongside these men, eating beside them, grieving them, depending on them with his life, he looked at them fully. He saw, in the almost imperceptible flatness behind their eyes, the architecture of something he had never let himself examine. Inhibitor chips sitting in each skull like dormant mechanisms, waiting for a frequency that had not yet been broadcast. The thought arrived not as fury, but as weight. He filed it in the category of things that required immediate addressing, immediately after the thing that required addressing right now. One thing at a time, as it always has been. He climbed the stairs. He opened the door to the High Council chamber without knocking. Anakin Skywalker stood alone at the curved transparisteel window facing west, toward the Senate district, toward the columns of smoke still rising from the lower levels. His back was to the door. His shoulders carried the posture of a man holding himself together with the last remaining threads of his discipline, each thread visible. Each one fraying under a weight that had grown too large for any one person to carry in silence. He turned when he heard the door. The relief that crossed his face was raw, unguarded, almost childlike in its intensity. It lasted only a moment before training reassembled it into something more controlled. Obi-Wan caught it. He had always been catching things about Anakin. He had simply, for too long, filed them under the wrong category. "Obi-Wan." Anakin's voice was steady. "Barely I wasn't expecting, I know." Obi-Wan crossed the chamber. Not quickly, not slowly, steadily, as he had learned to do everything after 19 years of practicing the art of doing nothing. "I need to tell you something before you tell me whatever you've decided you should say." Anakin blinked. I wasn't going to." "Anakin," he stopped directly in front of him. He looked at his former Padawan, fully, with the deliberate and unhurried attention of a man who was no longer in a rush, in the way he never permitted himself to look during 3 years of war, when there was always too much at stake to admit what he actually saw. He saw the exhaustion. He saw the terror that had been carefully packaged as anger for so long it had almost convinced its carrier that it was the real thing. He saw the grief of a man whose secret had grown so heavy it had begun to reshape his bones. He saw his brother. He opened his arms. The 38-year-old Obi-Wan Kenobi would never have done this. The code, the trained distance, the careful maintenance of Jedi emotional propriety, none of it would have permitted this. But the man who spent 19 years in a desert understanding precisely what that propriety had cost them both was utterly incapable of withholding it. For one shocked, rigid second, Anakin did not move. Then something cracked. Not loud. Quieter than a whisper, the sound of a dam giving way not in catastrophe but in relief. The long-held breath finally, at last, exhaled. His hands found the back of Obi-Wan's robes. One long shuddering exhalation moved through him, and he leaned the way a person leans when they have been holding themselves upright for so long they have forgotten that other people exist partly to be leaned upon. "I'm sorry," Obi-Wan said, against his brother's shoulder. His voice did not waver. "I'm sorry I failed you, Anakin. I was so focused on who you were supposed to become that I never fully saw who you already were. I won't make that mistake again." Anakin pulled back and looked at him. His eyes were bright. His face held the expression Obi-Wan had seen 100 times across 20 years. The face of someone given a gift they don't know how to accept, because they have been convinced, by increments too small to notice, that they don't deserve it. "What's happened to you?" Anakin asked quietly. Obi-Wan almost smiled. It was the small, precise smile of a man who has a very long answer to a very simple question. "I've been thinking," he said, "for what feels like a very long time." He turned toward the door. "Now come with me. We have perhaps 40 minutes before this galaxy changes in a direction we cannot recover from, and I will need every one of them to tell you what I know." Behind him, Anakin stared at the back of his master's robes for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to understand that something had irrevocably shifted in the man before him. Long enough to understand that whatever it was not something to argue with. Then he followed. He always had. The lower archives meditation chamber had been built during the early Clone Wars as a contingency for conversations that were never supposed to happen. The walls absorbed sound to military-grade specifications. The M shielding operated on a rotation of hours rather than days. The room knew how to hold weight. It had been built precisely for weight. Obi-Wan closed the door and turned to face Anakin. His former Padawan had followed him through the temple's lower corridors with the composure that only someone who knew Anakin Skywalker well would recognize as controlled unease, watching Obi-Wan the way one watches a figure in a dim corridor at night, trying to reconcile what one expects to see with what one is actually seeing, and failing entirely. "Sit down," Obi-Wan said. Anakin sat. This, too, was different from how it would ordinarily go. No question about where or how long. He simply lowered himself into the nearest chair, folded his hands in his lap, the flesh one and the mechanical one, and waited with the obedience of a man who had decided, without quite knowing when he decided it, to trust something larger than himself. Obi-Wan remained standing. He had spent 19 years sitting. He could afford to stand for a while. "I'm not going to ask you questions," he said. "I know the answers. I'm going to tell you what I know, and I need you to listen until I've finished." Anakin's jaw tightened, the micro-expression of a man whose every instinct is to interject, to fill silence, to respond. But he nodded. Obi-Wan said, "Sheev Palpatine." The name fell into the room like a stone into deep water. "Is Darth Sidious." The silence that followed had its own texture, dense and layered, the kind that forms when a statement is too large and the air needs a moment to reorganize around it. Anakin's face moved through approximately 5 separate expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Shock, disbelief, the reflexive protective surge of a man about to argue. And then, beneath all of it, like bedrock beneath shifting sand, recognition, the recognition of something a part of him had always suspected and had trained itself, very carefully and very thoroughly, not to think about directly. It was the expression of a man who had been holding a thought at arm's length for so long that his arms had gone numb. "Some part of you has known this for a long time," Obi-Wan said, before Anakin could speak. "The part of you that is, despite everything, a genuinely perceptive Jedi, a very good Jedi, though we failed to tell you so, has been filing away the anomalies for years. The Chancellor's impossible familiarity with separatist military strategy, his knowledge of events he shouldn't have known about, his extraordinary, detailed interest in you specifically, the way every significant development of this war has bent, with uncommon consistency, toward outcomes that served his position." He pulled a chair from the corner and sat across from Anakin. Not behind a desk, not elevated. Across from him, at the same level, the way equals sit. 3 years ago, Obi-Wan continued, Count Dooku told you the Senate was under the influence of a Sith Lord. You dismissed it. I would have too. But Dooku was not wrong about the fact. He was wrong about the conclusion he wanted you to draw from it. Anakin's hands had gone very still in his lap. Palpatine engineered this war from before it began. He created both sides of it. The war you have bled for, that your men have died in, that has cost the Republic 10,000 Jedi and 50 million soldiers, it is his creation. Every death is his authorship. He is the Sith Lord we have been hunting for a generation, and he has been hiding in the office of Supreme Chancellor, with all the legal and military authority of the Republic itself serving as his armor. Obi-Wan. Anakin's voice was careful. Controlled. How do you know this? It was exactly the right question. Obi-Wan had prepared his answer. I spent the last several hours in the deepest communion with the Force I have ever achieved, he said. What I received was not a prophecy. It was a pattern. The living Force does not speak in futures, it reveals connections that were always present. Invisible only because we were standing too close to see them clearly. I have been given distance. And distance, sometimes, is all it takes. This was true, in its fashion. True, from a certain point of view. Anakin studied him for a long moment, the particular searching look of a man trying to determine if he is being lied to and concluding, reluctantly, that he is not. He told me himself. Tonight, that he's a Sith Lord. Yes, and then he told me he could save Padme. The name came out differently from the rest of his words. Something raw moved through it. That she was going to die. In childbirth. Yes, Obi-Wan's tone did not shift, and you told Mace Windu. A silence. Anakin looked down, and Mace is preparing to lead an arrest team to the Chancellor's office, Obi-Wan continued, placing each fact down with the careful precision of a man laying surgical instruments in sequence. And you are standing in this room rather than going with him, which means some part of you has already understood that this is not as simple as it was supposed to be. What do you mean? I mean that Palpatine knew you would tell Mace. Obi-Wan leaned slightly forward. This is not a moment that happened to him. This is a moment he built. He has been patient for decades, Anakin. He is not surprised by anything that has occurred tonight. He planned for all of it. Anakin's eyes narrowed. What does he plan to do? He will fight Mace and the Masters. He will appear to be losing. Obi-Wan's voice was level, stripped of everything unnecessary. Absolute he will fall, and in falling, he will transform in front of your eyes. The powerful Chancellor becoming a withered, defeated old man, a victim. And then he will say one sentence, a pause that carried the weight of 19 years of thinking about exactly this moment. One sentence. And that sentence is the hinge on which your entire future turns. The room was very quiet. He's a traitor, Obi-Wan said softly. He's going to kill us all. He let it settle. And you will believe him, Anakin, not because it is true, but because in that moment, terrified for Padme, feeling abandoned by the Council, standing alone in a way that we failed to prevent, you will need it to be true. Because if Mace is the villain, then stopping him is heroic rather than monstrous. And you will reach for the heroism, because the alternative is to confront what you've already done. Anakin's hands had closed into fists in his lap. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. And if you stop Mace, Obi-Wan said, Palpatine will be beside you within seconds. He will give you a new name. You will have passed through a door that closes behind you. And everything, a beat, just a fraction long, weighted with 2 decades of desert silence and desert grief, everything will be lost. Obi-Wan did not fill the silence that followed. He had learned, across a very long time, to let silence do its work without interference. Then, quietly, Padme is not going to die in childbirth. Anakin looked up sharply. The movement was involuntary, pure reflex, the body responding before the mind could organize a defense against what it was hearing. She is alive right now, Obi-Wan said. Healthy, strong, the pregnancy is progressing exactly as it should. The vision Palpatine used to break you was crafted specifically for the shape of your fear, the way a key is crafted for the shape of a lock. She is not going to die, unless we allow tonight to go the way he intends. How do you know about Padme? Not a question. the flat voice of a man moving very carefully through very dangerous ground. Because the Force wanted me to know. Because I needed to understand, precisely and completely, what was at stake. Obi-Wan held his gaze. "Children," he said. Anakin went completely still. "Twins," Obi-Wan said. "A son and a daughter. Both of them strong in the Force. Both of them, if we do this right, going to grow up knowing who their father is." For a moment, Anakin Skywalker, chosen one, war hero, the most powerful Jedi of his generation, looked exactly like what he was underneath all of it. A 22-year-old boy who was absolutely terrified and absolutely in love, and had been carrying both of those things in isolation for so long that having someone simply name them felt like the lifting of a physical weight. "I knew about the marriage," Obi-Wan said. "I knew about the pregnancy. I said nothing, because I was a coward about the parts of you I didn't know how to reach." He didn't look away from it. "I won't be that coward again." The silence that followed was different in texture from every silence that came before it in this room. Quieter, somehow, cleaner. The silence of a space from which something that had been accumulating for a very long time had just been removed. "What do we do?" Anakin asked. His voice had shed something. The careful control, the defensive architecture, the performance of composure maintained in front of an audience. What remained was simpler, considerably stronger. Obi-Wan allowed himself the small, precise smile. "We don't go to Palpatine to fight him," he said. "Not yet. First, we go to Mace." He rose from his chair. "We go to Mace, and we change the nature of tonight entirely." He moved toward the door. Anakin was already standing. Mace Windu was not a man who lingered. He stood in the temple's third-floor corridor with Kit Fisto to his left, Saesee to his right, and Agen Kolar 3 steps behind, 4 Jedi Masters representing, between them, approximately a century and a half of combined combat experience and the kind of calm that can only be built by surviving things that should have killed you. The corridor felt smaller with all 4 of them in it, not uncomfortable, just compressed. The air between them carried the particular quality of men who had made a decision and were in the final moments before acting on it. Mace was speaking to Kit in the low, precise tones of a man running final checks on a plan he had already committed to, when Obi-Wan appeared at the corridor's far end. He walked toward them without hurrying. He always walked without hurrying. Tonight it was particularly pronounced, the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had arrived at his destination some time ago and was simply allowing his body to catch up. "Kenobi," Mace's voice carried the faintest note of impatience, the sound of a man whose schedule had just been complicated by someone he respected too much to dismiss. "This isn't the moment." "I know," Obi-Wan said. He stopped in front of them. "I only need 5 minutes. 5 minutes that Palpatine doesn't have." Mace turned his head toward the exit corridor. "The longer he sits in that office, the more certain he is that tonight will go exactly the way he planned." Obi-Wan placed the word with deliberate care. It landed precisely the way he intended it to land. "Masters, he's expecting you." A pause. Kit Fisto's wide eyes shifted from Mace to Obi-Wan, with the expression of a man who recognized, when he heard it, the sound of a very different kind of problem being introduced into a conversation that thought it was already settled. "Obviously he's expecting us," Mace said. Skywalker told him the Council had been informed. "No." Obi-Wan's voice was patient, the specific patience of a man who had 20 minutes of information to deliver and had learned, through long practice, that the human mind receives important things better when they're not rushed at it. He's not expecting an arrest, he's expecting a confrontation. There is a difference, and tonight it is the most important difference in the galaxy. He looked at Mace directly. "What does a Sith Lord do when cornered?" "Fights," Saesee said. His voice was like stone shifting beneath weight. "He fights," Obi-Wan agreed. "And in fighting, what does he gain?" He looked at each face in turn, giving each man the weight of the question. He gains the authority to use force. He gains the narrative of Jedi aggression. He gives the Senate a choice between a powerful chancellor who claims he was attacked without provocation and an order that has just drawn weapons on the head of state during a time of war. Kit Fisto was quiet. Aegon Kolar had turned fully toward Obi-Wan, giving him his complete attention. Between Aegon Kolar and complete attention, there was rarely any intermediate space. He has planned for Jedi Masters with lightsabers, Obi-Wan continued. He has planned, in extraordinary detail, for precisely what an arrest team looks like, and exactly how to turn it against us. He has not planned, a fractional pause, for a Jedi Master with evidence. Mace Windu's face was unreadable. This was not, for Mace, unusual. What was unusual was the quality of attention behind it. The specific stillness of a man doing very fast, very careful work behind an exterior designed to reveal nothing while the work was in progress. "You're proposing we don't arrest him," Mace said. "I'm proposing we don't go through his door the way he has positioned his defenses for." Obi-Wan clasped his hands behind his back, the posture of a man who had had a long time to consider what he was about to say and was now simply relaying it. His entire strategy for tonight rests on one pivot: Anakin Skywalker alone, torn between loyalty and fear, arriving at the Chancellor's office in a state of maximum vulnerability. Palpatine will present himself as victim, the Jedi as aggressors, and Anakin as the only man capable of seeing the truth, which is, conveniently, the truth that serves Palpatine's purposes. "And your proposal?" Mace's voice was flat, neutral, the voice of a man extending judgment the courtesy of waiting. "Anakin and I go first, not as an arrest team, as an informal visit. Anakin has legitimate reason to be there. I accompany him as his," Obi-Wan allowed a beat of the driest possible understatement, "concerned colleague. Palpatine will attempt his seduction. He will reach for Anakin's fear about Padme, his mistrust of the Council, his feeling of isolation that we failed to correct years ago. He will lay out the script he has been writing for more than 2 decades. A pause. "And we will let him." Kit made a sound that might have been the beginning of a question and decided against completing itself. "Because," Obi-Wan said, "every master manipulator carries one weakness, and Palpatine is no exception to it." He held each gaze in turn, unhurried, systematic, the gaze of a man reporting a conclusion he had already reached and tested. Pride. He has kept his identity secret for 30 years. He has built a civilization-scale deception without a single visible crack. When he believes he has won, when he believes Anakin is within his grasp, and there is no one in the room capable of stopping him, he will be unable to resist naming himself. It is the nature of the Sith. They require their enemy to understand how completely they have been outplayed. The reveal is not a tactical error. For them, it is the reward. A silence. The corridor breathed around them, ventilation, the distant hum of the building systems, the faint percussion of a city continuing its business on the other side of the walls. "We record the conversation," Obi-Wan said. "Every word. When Palpatine has provided the self-identification the Senate will require to act, when the recording contains what we need, you and the Masters enter. Not as aggressors, as witnesses." Mace studied him for a long time. The study was thorough, the specific thoroughness that Mace Windu brought to very few things. That meant the man inside the unreadable exterior was testing the proposition against every alternative he could construct and finding. With the reluctance of a man whose model of how things work had just been significantly revised, that the alternatives kept losing. "You're betting the Republic," Mace said finally, "on the arrogance of a Sith Lord." "I'm betting the Republic," Obi-Wan replied, "on the fact that I understand him better than he knows I do." A beat that carried its own particular weight. "Give me 1 hour, Master Windu. If I'm wrong, you've lost nothing but time. If I'm right, we walk out of that office with everything we need to end this, without igniting the war that follows an assassination." Mace looked at Kit Fisto, who had for 3 years watched Obi-Wan Kenobi navigate situations that should have been impossible and arrive, somehow. At the other side of them, with most of his limbs and all of his composure intact, gave a slight shrug that meant approximately, "I wouldn't bet against him." It was one of the more reassuring gestures Obi-Wan had ever received from anyone. Mace looked at Aegon Kolar. Aegon gave nothing. He didn't object. From Aegon Kolar, in this context, not objecting carried the full weight of agreement. Saesee remained still, which from Saesee communicated the same. 1 hour, Mace said, We hold position 1 level below. On your signal. On my signal, Obi-Wan confirmed. He turned to go. He had taken perhaps 3 steps when Mace's voice arrived from behind him, quieter than before, carrying a quality entirely different from the operational tone of the last several minutes. Not the voice of the Council's enforcer, not the voice of a man conducting a security briefing, something older than either of those, and more direct. Something that had been waiting for a private moment to ask its question. Kenobi. Obi-Wan stopped. What happened to you? Not rhetorical, not suspicious. Genuine, the question of a man who had known Obi-Wan Kenobi for 20 years, who had fought beside him and argued with him and occasionally wanted to strangle him, and who was now looking at someone who was recognizably the same person, and recognizably, in some way that resisted precise naming, not entirely the same person at all. Obi-Wan considered the question. He thought of the desert, not as abstraction but as physical fact, the specific weight of 19 years of sand and wind, and the twin suns moving across a sky that asked nothing of him. He thought of what it cost to receive that gift, and what it eventually gave back. He thought of a warmth that arrived in the Force before it arrived as words, and of the particular patience of a man who had already passed through the hardest door in existence, and found, to his own evident amusement, that there was another room on the other side, and that the room was not empty. He thought of what it meant to have been shown the shape of a catastrophe in time to prevent it. "I've been consulting with a very wise old man," he said. "He sends his regards." Mace's voice was careful. "Who?" A pause, precisely as long as it needed to be. "Qui-Gon," Obi-Wan said. He didn't look back to see Mace's expression. He didn't need to. He and Anakin moved toward the exit. When he brings up Padam, Obi-Wan said, "I want you to say exactly this. I've already spoken to Padam. She knows everything. Nothing more. Don't explain what everything means. Don't defend it. Say it and let the silence do the work." They were moving through Coruscant's traffic lanes, the speeder cutting between slower civilian craft, Anakin at the controls with the unconscious mastery that had always made the act of piloting look like thinking. His hands were steady on the controls. The rest of him was doing something considerably more complicated. "He'll know I'm lying," Anakin said. "He'll know you might be lying. There's a difference. Uncertainty is what we want him sitting with." Obi-Wan watched the Senate District's towers resolving through the forward viewport, and when he reaches for the Council, when he says they've never trusted you, that they've always held you back, don't argue. Don't defend them. Say, "I've been talking to Obi-Wan. We see things more clearly now, and mean it. Because it's true." That's vague. Precisely, a ghost of a smile. Palpatine is a man who fills vague spaces with his own assumptions. Let him fill this one. He will construct a version of tonight that fits the story he needs to be true, the story where you've been partially turned, where there's still an opening. He needs that story. He will find it in the ambiguity if we give him the ambiguity to find. Obi-Wan looked ahead again. And while he does that, we give him exactly enough rope. Anakin was quiet for a moment. The recording device. Already in place. Obi-Wan touched the cuff of his sleeve, briefly, casually, the gesture of a man checking the time. The kind of movement a room full of observers would register as nothing at all. It transmits to a secured archive channel. The moment Palpatine names himself, we have what we need. The Senate Executive Building materialized through the viewport. Enormous, ringed with light. The architectural embodiment of everything the Republic had ever believed about itself. That power, properly organized and properly contained, becomes the servant of civilization rather than its destroyer. In another version of tonight, Anakin Skywalker would watch it become the seat of an empire. He would stand at Darth Sidious's side while a civilization applauded its own destruction. Not this time. Anakin landed the speeder on the private arrival platform of the Senate Executive Building with the precision of a man who had done it 100 times, because he had. The building's security systems recognized his biometric clearance without requiring further verification. The Senate commandos at Palpatine's outer chamber did not react with alarm. Skywalker was a known face here. Kenobi was the kind of man whose bearing invited no challenges. They passed through the outer door and into the suite's corridor, soft lighting, aged wood panels, the quiet opulence of a man who understood, early in his career, that real power prefers not to announce itself loudly. Palpatine was standing when they entered. This was information. He had arranged himself for their arrival, positioned not behind his desk but beside the window, the city planet spread golden below him, the whole of the Republic his backdrop. It was, Obi-Wan recognized, the unconscious staging of a man who had done this so many times that every movement was a calculation wearing the mask of instinct. He had chosen the window. He had chosen the light. He had decided where his guests would stand in relation to him before they arrived. His eyes moved from Anakin to Obi-Wan. They stayed on Obi-Wan for exactly 2 seconds longer than they should. "Anakin, my boy." The warmth in his voice was extraordinary, rich, unhurried, the particular warmth of someone who had invested decades in making you believe it cost him nothing to give. And Obi-Wan. This is a beat that performed surprise without quite being surprised, unexpected. A pleasant one, of course. Chancellor. Obi-Wan's bow was faultlessly correct. "Forgive the intrusion. Anakin wanted to speak with you, and I thought I should accompany him, given the gravity of what he shared with me." The pause that followed was infinitesimal, not a hesitation. Palpatine was too skilled for hesitation, but a recalibration, the faintest adjustment of the machinery behind the warmth. "Of course," Palpatine said, gesturing toward the seating area. "Please, come in. Sit." The chess match began. Palpatine moved first, as he always moved first, with the opening that had served him longest, concern. He was worried about Anakin. He was worried about the war's toll on him, about the way the Council had always kept him at arm's length, about the particular loneliness of being the most powerful man in a room full of people who would never fully acknowledge it. He spoke the way a man speaks, who had made a very careful study of what this particular listener most needed to hear, and had been refining that study for 22 years. Anakin said, "I've been talking to Obi-Wan. I think I was looking for problems in the wrong direction." Palpatine's smile held. His eyes didn't. He tried another angle. The war, nearly won, and what followed it. Anakin's future. The things the Jedi Code placed permanently out of reach. A real life. A family. The happiness that men who had sworn themselves to detachment had quietly agreed to pretend didn't matter. His voice carried the specific warmth of a man who considered himself the only person in this room honest enough to name what everyone else refused to. Obi-Wan said, mildly, "I imagine the Chancellor is eager to see this conflict resolved. We all are." Something shifted in Palpatine's approach. Not visibly, his expression didn't change. His posture didn't alter. But Obi-Wan felt it the way one feels the temperature change when stepping from sunlight into shadow. The Sith Lord was reorienting, identifying what the new terrain would allow. He tried the Padme gambit. "You must be terrified," he said to Anakin, with the particular gentleness of a man who knew precisely where the bruise was and was pressing on it softly, for Senator Amidala. "The stress of these times, for someone in her condition—" "I've already spoken to Padme," Anakin said. "She knows everything." Silence. It was a silence of exactly the right quality, not the silence of a bluff successfully called, but the silence of a man taking stock of new information in a landscape that had subtly, unexpectedly shifted beneath him. The silence of machinery encountering something it was not built to process and running the calculation again. "Does she?" Palpatine said. Not a question. "Yes." Anakin held his gaze. His voice was steady. He had been told it would be difficult, and he had been told to hold anyway, and he held. Palpatine's eyes moved to Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan met them with the expression of a man who had arrived at this conversation some time before the conversation began, who had been present, in some important sense, since before the door opened. "We know about the Sith training, Chancellor," Obi-Wan said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man reading from a list of things he had already confirmed, and was simply now presenting in sequence. The communications routed through HoloNet relays bearing the signature of a dead man. The alterations to the clone army's command architecture. A pause. The shape of the plan. A long silence. Palpatine was still. The quality of his stillness was different now, not the stillness of a man selecting his next word, but the stillness of something much older and colder, identifying the precise dimensions of an unexpected trap and working out whether there was a door in any of the walls. "You're bluffing," he said. "Am I?" Obi-Wan tilted his head a fraction. "Then, why have you stopped trying to convince me?" The warmth left Palpatine's face. Not dramatically, not the theatrical transformation that would itself be a manipulation. This was quieter, and in its quietness more true. The warmth simply receded, the way a tide recedes, steadily, without announcement, until what remained was the thing that was always underneath it. What surfaced was not evil. Precisely, it was age. The specific, bone-deep age of a man who had been performing for so long that he had forgotten what his own face looked like at rest. The exhaustion of decades of maintenance finally allowed to show itself. "You can stop performing," Obi-Wan said, quietly and without drama. "Darth Sidious. We didn't come to negotiate." The name settled in the room like a bell struck once, its resonance filling every corner before fading into a silence that was not empty. Palpatine regarded Obi-Wan for a long moment. The assessment behind his eyes was extraordinary, fast, deep, comprehensive, the work of a man who had survived decades of impossible situations by never once underestimating the distance between what he expected and what he found. He was doing that work now. He was finding a gap he didn't know existed, and measuring it, and finding it larger than it should be. "You are," he said slowly, considerably more than I anticipated, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Not the line of a cornered man, the line of a connoisseur acknowledging, with genuine and reluctant precision, something well made. "I know," Obi-Wan said simply. From beneath the aged wood of the Chancellor's desk, from the shadows of an office that had served as the nerve center of a civilization-scale deception for 30 years, came the soft, unmistakable sound of an ancient lightsaber hilt clearing its robes. There is a species of combat that happens too fast for the conscious mind to track, where the body takes over entirely. Acting on training so deep it has become something closer to instinct, while the thinking brain watches from behind the eyes and simply tries to keep pace with the record. And then there is Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was already moving before Palpatine's blade fully ignited, not running, stepping, deliberately, sideways and forward in the same motion. His own lightsaber rising to guard position in a movement of such unconscious economy that it looked, to anyone watching, like something being done in sleep. He had moved 3 feet to the right of where he was standing, and those 3 feet were the precise distance between Palpatine's initial lunge and the place where Anakin Skywalker would have been. Would have been. The crimson blade passed through empty space, struck nothing, and Palpatine, who had not missed an opening strike in a very long career of combat, found himself, for the first time in living memory, at the wrong end of his own momentum. The Masters came through the door. Kit Fisto arrived first, his green blade already lit, a blur of motion. For once, for the first time, in this version of events, he was fighting at full capacity rather than dying in the first second before the fight had properly begun. Saesitian moved with the silent, concentrated economy of a man who had survived 100 engagements that should have been his last. Anakin Skywalker took his position, and his presence itself, still standing and still armed, was already a deviation from the way this night was supposed to go. Mace Windu came through last, purple blade ignited, his expression carrying the specific focus of a man who had resolved all doubt outside the door and brought only decision through it. 6 Jedi. Palpatine and 6 Jedi. Palpatine was extraordinary. Even against this number. Even without the devastating surprise element he had relied upon, he was a force of such concentrated and ancient power that the air around him seemed to reject the normal rules, reality itself recoiling from the dark side in its most distilled form. He moved like no human being had any right to move, with a speed and precision born from a tradition 2,000 years in the building. And for several seconds the Jedi were not winning or losing, but simply contained, held in the gravitational field of something enormous, navigating around it rather than through it. But Obi-Wan was not trying to beat him. He was trying to deny him. Sorasu, Form the Third, the Resilience Form, was not designed for victory. It was designed for survival. In the hands of a competent master, It kept you alive until an opening presented itself. In the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi, shaped by 19 years of practicing in the silence of a desert until there was no longer any distinction between the technique and the man employing it, it was something else entirely. A mirror. A wall. A presence that could not be eliminated, and could not be moved, and simply, inexorably, stood between Palpatine and the thing he needed. The killing blow meant for Palpatine, a move Obi-Wan had replayed in his memory 1,000 times in 19 years of desert nights, the move that in another version of this fight ended the Itochi master before his guard was fully raised, was met by a blade that was already there. Not arriving, already there. Palpatine checked his stroke mid-execution and looked at Obi-Wan with the expression of a man who had just encountered a piece of furniture in a room where he was absolutely certain there was no furniture. "You knew that was coming," he said, not an accusation. An observation from a scientist who had found a data point that didn't fit his model and was, despite everything, genuinely interested in the anomaly. "I know several things that are coming," Obi-Wan replied. He stepped left to cover Kit's flank, the movement as natural as breathing, requiring no decision. "I find it simplifies the process enormously." Anakin fought beside him. And this Anakin was different from the Anakin of the original story in one crucial and total way: he was listening. Not to instructions, there was no time or space for instructions, but to the rhythm of Obi-Wan's movement, to the language of how he positioned himself in the space around him. He was adapting the way the finest pilots adapted to unfamiliar spacecraft, through feel. Through the unconscious translation of observation into response. Where Obi-Wan moved left, Anakin filled right. Where Obi-Wan held the center, Anakin covered the flank. They had been doing this for 20 years without ever quite doing it on purpose, and now, finally, they were doing it on purpose. Palpatine attacked Anakin directly. Not the careful, strategic feints he ran against the others, but something more fundamental, a reach for the bond between them. 22 years of careful investment, the threads he had spent a career weaving into the fabric of the young man's trust and fear and need. He reached for Anakin's eyes with his own, searching for the specific opening that had always been there. Anakin met his gaze and said, without raising his voice, "You lied to me." 3 words. Not a declaration. Not a battle cry. The flat, unadorned statement of a man who had done the accounting and arrived at a number he didn't need to argue about. Something flickered in Palpatine's eyes. Not fear. Not defeat. Something more precise than either, the expression of a chess player who had seen, for the first time, a board configuration that his model declared impossible, and who was doing very rapid work to understand how it came to exist. The bond was still there. He could feel it, the 22 years of it. But the man on the other end had somehow altered the nature of what the bond connected. He was not losing this fight. Not against 6 opponents, each of whom he could individually match and had individually studied. But he was not winning in the way he needed to win. He needed Anakin's betrayal, the specific emotional crisis, timed to the specific moment that turned a Jedi Knight into a dark side instrument in the space of one terrible decision. He needed the victim narrative. He needed the look on Anakin Skywalker's face that meant, "I have chosen you." None of it was available. The calculation took perhaps 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, 3 more strikes were turned aside by the man in worn Jedi robes, who stood at the center of the room and could not seem to be moved from it, and whose blade was never quite where Palpatine expected it to be, and always exactly where it needed to be. Obi-Wan stood in the fight the way water stood in a storm. It moved around him. It could not change him. The force push that Palpatine released was not a tactic. It was the decision of a man who had recognized that this angle offered nothing and had chosen, in an instant, to stop pretending otherwise. It hit all 6 Jedi simultaneously, a shockwave of raw, unmediated power that threw Kit Fisto into the far wall, staggered Palpatine, took Agen Kolar from his feet, and moved even Mace. Which almost nothing moved. Obi-Wan let himself be moved, rolling with it rather than bracing against it, the water yielding to the storm because the water had learned through long practice that yielding and breaking were not the same thing. When he looked up, the viewport behind Palpatine's desk was gone. Not cracked. Gone. The transparisteel blown outward in a cascade of fragments that caught the city's light as they fell, glittering, into the hundreds of meters of open Coruscant air below. The night breathed through the gap, cold and carrying the distant murmur of a city that didn't yet know what had happened in this room. Palpatine was gone with it. The office settled around the 6 Jedi. Obi-Wan rose. Kit Fisto was already pulling himself upright, checking his blade with the reflex of long habit. Agen Kolar found his footing and stared at his own hands for a moment, with the expression of a man who was alive in a way he didn't entirely understand yet. Alive in a way that in another version of tonight, he simply was not. Mace Windu stood in the center of the ruined room and looked at Obi-Wan with an expression that was not quite awe and not quite suspicion, but occupied exactly the space between them, the expression of a man whose model of how things work had just been revised in 2 significant places in the same evening. "He's heading for the Senate chamber," Obi-Wan said. Mace's voice was measured. "How do you know?" "Because it's the only play he has left." Obi-Wan extinguished his blade in a single clean motion and moved toward the door. If he can't be the victim, he'll try to be the Emperor. He'll go where the audience is. He looked back at Mace steadily. "But he's not the only one with something left to play. We have perhaps 20 minutes. Obi-Wan said it as they moved through the Senate Executive Building's lower service corridors, moving fast now, the measured pace of the last hour set aside in favor of something more urgent, because certain things could not be leisurely without becoming irreversible. Anakin was beside him, stride for stride. Before what? Before the Order 66 signal transmits through the clone army's command architecture. Obi-Wan turned a corner without hesitation, navigating from memory, the memory of a man who had spent 19 years reconstructing, in painstaking detail, every piece of the trap he had survived. The inhibitor chips in the clones are pre-positioned. The signal is already coded and queued in Palpatine's private communications suite. 2 floors below us, Anakin's expression went sharp. He was going to send it tonight. The moment he declared the Empire, yes, his first act as Emperor would have been to eliminate the Jedi simultaneously and galaxy-wide. No coordination, no warning, no chance to respond. 23 sectors, all at once. Obi-Wan's voice was even. He had had a long time to think about this, and the thinking had done its work. The clones are not traitors, Anakin. They are victims. Men with mechanisms in their skulls that their designers placed there without their knowledge or consent, and without their understanding of what those mechanisms were built to do. Can we stop it? If we move now. Yes, Anakin's communicator was already in his hand. R2, East Service entrance, now, a rapid burst of binary in response, the particular cadence of R2-D2 moving at speed through a building that didn't expect him. Anakin translated without thinking, the reflex of years. 12 minutes out, he'll need the service clearance code. Which you have, Obi-Wan said. Which I have. They found the Chancellor's private communications suite 2 floors below the main office. It had been built into the building's architecture 20 years ago during a routine security upgrade that no one on the maintenance staff had known to question, compact, unassuming, the kind of room designed to appear as though it served an ordinary purpose while serving a very different one. It connected via hardline to the HoloNet relay node beneath the building's foundation, the same node that carried signal for the entire Senate district. Anakin was at the main terminal before the door had finished opening. His hands moved across the interface with the specific quality of focus he brought to technical problems. The total absorption of a mind that read machines the way most people read faces, that saw the logic of a system's architecture the way most people saw the layout of a room. He didn't need to understand every component. He understood the shape of the thing. And the shape, once understood, revealed where it bent. The Order 66 signal is configured through the HoloNet relay under this building, he said, reading the queued protocols at the speed of long practice. GAR command frequency. His jaw set. It's already in queue. There's a timer. He read the remaining time and didn't say the number aloud. The number was not the kind that benefited from being spoken. 15 minutes. R2-D2 rolled through the door, trailing a clearance transponder Anakin had remotely unlocked from the building's main grid. The little droid took in the situation with a brief sweep of his sensor array, plugged directly into the communications suite's secondary port, and began working with the particular efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a problem, they could actually solve. R2 can interface with the relay node's secondary access protocol, Anakin said, already entering authorization codes, but the primary override requires a full Republic military authentication stamp. General rank, active duty. I have those. He didn't look up from the terminal. The counter command needs to be framed as a GAR-wide stand-down. Military authenticity. It has to route through a channel the chips can't ignore. The chips are hardwired to respond to Order 66 specifically, Obi-Wan said, but they're also hardwired to respond to conflicting orders from the legitimate chain of command above that level. If the counter command arrives with sufficient authentication before Order 66 fully processes, it creates a conflict in the chip's decision tree. Anakin finished the thought without looking up from the interface, which might not stop it entirely, but it'll slow it down. Create hesitation in the command response. Give the clones the fraction of a second they need to. He stopped. He looked up. Obi-Wan. The biometric authentication. Highest level authorization on this system requires secondary verification. Palpatine's personal security code or his biometric signature. R2 beeped, a single note that was, in binary, the precise equivalent of found a problem. I know. Obi-Wan was already moving to the desk on the far wall. He opened the lower drawer, with the certainty of a man who knew exactly what he would find there, because he had spent 19 years thinking about every piece of this puzzle. And this particular piece had taken 2 years of quiet desert consideration to locate, and another 3 to confirm. Inside, a small, flat data chip and a shielded case, the shielding itself a kind of signature. The fingerprint of a man who would never build a system he couldn't access from a position of physical disadvantage, his contingency access chip. The biometric profile is encoded on it. Anakin stared at him. The question was entirely visible on his face. He didn't ask it, not because he didn't want to, but because there were 13 minutes left and some things were better saved for later. R2 took the chip, processed it, produced a rising cadence of binary that translated, roughly, as working on it, carrying the specific emotional register of a being who had encountered a problem of appropriate complexity and was applying appropriate effort. The counter command won't save everyone, Obi-Wan said. He said it quietly, standing behind Anakin, not as comfort but as fact. The kind of fact that needed to be named clearly rather than softened, because people doing something difficult in full knowledge of its limits did it better than people doing something difficult while pretending the limits didn't exist. Some chips are older hardware. Some clones are in sectors where signal latency will allow Order 66 to process before the counter command arrives. There will be deaths. Individual engagements where the timing cannot be bridged. Anakin's hands stilled for a fraction of a second on the terminal. But the temple will stand, Obi-Wan said. The Order will survive. The men we can reach, we will reach. A pause that carried its own particular weight. Not the weight of resignation, but the weight of honesty. That's all anyone can do. Reach the ones they can reach. Anakin nodded once. His hands resumed their work. R2 beeped, authentication integrated. 30 seconds to broadcast, Anakin said. The counter command took shape on the terminal, Republic Military Security Order, Protocol Class Emergency, Command Authority General Anakin Skywalker of the 501st Legion. Authentication stamp legitimate, and verified at the highest clearance the GAR command architecture recognized. Not a cancellation of Order 66. Something more precise, a simultaneous broadcast on the same command frequency with equal authentication weight, creating an irresolvable conflict in the inhibitor chip's decision architecture. A conflict that would require the clones' own minds to resolve. Clone troopers, in the experience of 2 men who had fought beside them for 3 years, were not empty vessels. They were soldiers. And soldiers, when given a genuine reason to pause, generally found one. 10 seconds, Anakin said. R2 beeped rapidly, the sound of a small being doing something large. Obi-Wan stood very still. 5. The terminal's interface flickered. 2. Anakin pressed the final authorization. 1. The broadcast sent. The room went quiet. R2 produced a single subdued note, the binary equivalent of done, carrying the specific register of a being who understood the weight of what had just happened and was choosing not to perform relief about it. Then, from the communications channels the suite was still monitoring, fragments. A clone captain in the Outer Rim, reporting conflicting orders and requesting verification from command, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who is grateful for something to verify. A squad in the mid-rim, standing down pending authentication clarification. A general on Coruscant's surface reporting that the 501st had received contradictory directives and was awaiting command resolution. The steadiness in his transmission, the steadiness of a man who wanted a reason to stop and had just been given one. And from the temple, silence. Not the silence of catastrophe, not the silence of an ending. The ordinary silence of a building going about its late evening business, the sound of something that had not happened, which was a kind of sound that only people who knew what was supposed to happen could fully hear. Anakin slumped back in his chair. His hands rested in his lap, and they were shaking, the fine, involuntary tremor of a body that had been running on sustained will for several hours, and was only now, in the absence of immediate demand, allowing itself to acknowledge the cost. "Is it enough?" he asked. Obi-Wan was still listening to the channel. Doing the accounting, the honest, unsentimental arithmetic of what had been saved and what could not be. There were losses already in it, isolated incidents, places where the gap between Order 66 and the counter-command was too small to bridge. He let himself know this. He didn't look away from it. "It's enough to matter," he said. He meant it, not as comfort, as fact. The purge is broken. The order survives. One breath, measured and complete. Now there is one thing left. He looked at Anakin. "The Senate," he said. "Palpatine is already there. He's going to try to finish this from the podium." Anakin was on his feet before the sentence ended. Palpatine spoke with the authority of a man who had not yet been told that authority was contextual. He stood in the Chancellor's pod, elevated, centered, the whole of the Senate arrayed as his audience, and delivered the speech he had been preparing for this moment with the particular skill of someone who had rehearsed it for decades. The Jedi Order had staged a coup. They attacked him without provocation. He was a survivor, a servant of democracy who barely escaped with his life. And the Republic, his Republic, must now take the action the moment demanded. He was very good at this. So good that for the first 3 minutes, senators who had spent years quietly collecting doubts about Palpatine's accumulating powers felt, despite themselves, the pull of it, the narrative logic, the righteous clarity, the relief of having a villain that wasn't the man at the podium. Then the chamber doors opened. Bail Organa entered first. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had made his decision and was simply in the process of acting on it, the specific confidence of someone who had been building toward this moment for 2 years and had the materials ready before the signal arrived. He had received Obi-Wan's encrypted transmission 43 minutes ago. He had spent those 43 minutes making 3 calls and gathering the documentation he had always hoped he wouldn't need, and had always made certain he had ready. Mon Mothma followed him. Her bearing carried the precision of a woman who had spent 20 years in this building, understanding what it could be made to do when used with accuracy rather than spectacle. She was not here to perform. She was here to work. And then Padma Amidala walked in. She walked the way Padma Amidala walked everywhere, as though gravity were a courtesy she was extending to the planet beneath her feet, rather than a force acting upon her. She was dressed in plain senatorial robes rather than her elaborate state costume, and the plainness of it made her somehow more formidable. She was not performing tonight. She was simply present, and Padma Amidala, simply present, was one of the most politically precise forces this chamber had ever contained. Beside her, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Beside Obi-Wan, Anakin Skywalker. The 4 of them, Organa, Mothma, Amidala, 2 Jedi, arriving simultaneously, clearly coordinated, from different entry points, it had an effect on the Senate chamber that no single dramatic entrance could have produced. It reoriented attention. It communicated, without a word spoken, that the story being told from the Chancellor's pod was not the only story being told tonight. Palpatine's speech stopped. Not dramatically, he didn't lose his composure, because Palpatine's composure had not been lost in a very long career, and was not lost now. But the rhythm of it changed, became, for just a moment, something reaching rather than flowing. Padme activated her senatorial pod's holographic display. The recording began. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The Senate of the Galactic Republic listened to Darth Sidious describe, in his own words and in the voice he never intended to have recorded, the shape of what he had built. Not in exhaustive detail, Obi-Wan had not needed to prompt him toward detail. The Sith Lord's pride had done that work without assistance, but in outline. The acknowledgement of his identity. The confirmation that both sides of this war shared a single author. The thing that, once heard across the Senate chamber's acoustic amplification, could not be unheard. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then Mon Mothma moved. She moved with the legislative precision of a woman who had spent 20 years waiting for exactly this, who had. In the quiet hours of long sessions when nothing important seemed to be happening, been building the procedural scaffolding for the moment when the truth could finally be acted upon. The motion of no confidence took 12 seconds to introduce. The motion for emergency audit of all executive emergency powers, prepared in advance and already sitting in the documentation queue, took 8 seconds more. The motion demanding a Senate-supervised investigation into the Clone Army's command architecture was introduced by Bail Organa, who read it in the steady voice of a man who was doing something permanent and knew it, and had decided that knowing it was not a reason to stop. The chamber's response was not unanimous. It never was. In a functioning democracy, there was disbelief, denial, the natural resistance that any mind brought to information, requiring it to reorganize everything it thought it understood. There were senators who had prospered under Palpatine's favor and were not eager to surrender it. There were those who were simply frightened of the implications, of the alternatives, of the sheer scale of what the recording described. But there were more who had been quietly filing away anomalies for years, in the part of the mind that noticed things the rest of the mind had decided not to examine directly. And those senators, the ones who had been holding an unformed suspicion at a careful distance from themselves, found, in 4 minutes and 37 seconds of someone else's recorded voice, that the suspicion had finally been given a shape they could act on. Obi-Wan rose to speak. He rose in Padme's pod, she offered him the floor with a glance, and he accepted with the slight inclination of his head that said both thank you and I understand what this costs in a single gesture. He stood at the pod's edge and looked out at the Senate chamber, 1,000 faces looking back at him, senators and aides and the accumulated weight of a civilization in a moment of genuine decision. He did not speak as a Jedi Master. He had spent 38 years being a Jedi Master, and it was real, and it had been useful, and it was not what this moment needed. He spoke as a citizen of the Republic, in the quiet voice of a man who had learned, through very long practice, that quiet forced the room to lean toward him rather than away, which was the oldest instrument in any orator's inventory, and was old because it worked. He spoke about service, about what the Republic actually was, not what its monuments claimed it to be, but what it was in practice. In the accumulated decisions of 10,000 senators across 1,000 years, in the ordinary choices of beings who decided, in each generation, to try to be stronger together than apart. He spoke about the clones, not as weapons or soldiers, but as people, men born into bondage they didn't know was bondage, who found something resembling dignity in what they chose to do with the lives they had been handed, and who deserved, at minimum, to make choices with their own bodies that hadn't been engineered into their skulls without their knowledge or consent. And then he spoke about Anakin Skywalker. He said it plainly, the way he had learned to say things that mattered, that a boy from Tatooine was told his entire life that he was special, and experienced being special as a form of isolation, because specialness without belonging was just loneliness with better press. That a man gave everything he had to a war he didn't start, for a civilization that hadn't always been worthy of what he gave it. That underneath the power and the anger and the fear there was something in Anakin Skywalker that was simply, stubbornly, incapably good. Anakin, standing in the pod beside him, felt the chamber shift when Obi-Wan said his name. Not toward judgment, toward something older and more complicated and, in the end, considerably more generous. "This republic has never been a perfect thing," Obi-Wan said. His voice filled the dome without being raised. The dome did the work for him, carrying it to the highest tiers, the farthest pods, the places where the recording was still faintly resonating. It has been a flawed, contested, frequently infuriating argument between beings who disagree about nearly everything. It has failed its citizens in ways that were not accidental, and its institutions have been used for purposes they were never designed to serve. A pause. The chamber held it with him. But it has also been, at its best, the most extraordinary collective agreement in galactic history, that we are responsible to each other, that the strong do not have the right to determine the fate of the weak. That power requires justification. He looked out across the 1,000 faces. What you heard tonight is what happens when that argument is lost, when a single mind decides it has the right to resolve every disagreement by will alone. He let the silence carry what it needed to carry. The question before this Senate is not whether Sheev Palpatine is guilty of the things that recording describes. That question has been answered. He looked once toward the Chancellor's pod, where Palpatine stood, still and silent, the face of a man measuring angles and finding none of them favorable. The question is, what kind of civilization you choose to be in your response to it. The vote was not unanimous. It was not close. The declaration of empire failed by a margin that would be quoted in histories for 1,000 years. Palpatine stood in his pod above a Senate that had just voted against him, and looked at the tally board with the face of a man who had spent decades constructing an outcome that had just been unmade in a single hour. He was very still. The stillness of a man doing a final calculation, arriving at a result, and deciding what to do with it. Then he raised his hand. Palpatine was done with democracy. He had been patient for 50 years. He had been subtle for 30. He had constructed a deception so comprehensive that the beings best equipped to identify it spent a generation enforcing the conditions of their own subjugation. He had been, by any reasonable measure, the most patient man in galactic history. Patience was over. The force storm he called down was not a performance, not a tactical decision, not the carefully calibrated power of a man managing how much he revealed. It was the unmediated expression of what a Sith Lord actually was, beneath the warmth, beneath the grandfatherly smile, beneath decades of careful performance, when the performance was no longer necessary. It was power without filter, dark side without container, the full weight of 2,000 years of accumulated resentment at a galaxy that refused to become what he needed it to be. Senate pods exploded. The great democratic architecture of 1,000 years buckled under forces it was never designed to accommodate. Senators who had not yet reached the exits scattered and fell, the orderly evacuation system overwhelmed by the reality that the thing in the Chancellor's pod had stopped pretending. Anakin moved first, not toward Palpatine, toward the senators who hadn't made it out. He was through the chaos before the conscious mind could have planned it, moving with the specific, total focus of a man who thought in motion, who had spent his entire life being most himself in the moment when everyone else had stopped knowing what to do. He caught a senator from Malastare thrown from her pod, her robe burning, and got her to the floor where the smoke was thinner. He extended his free hand, and the force deflected a surge of lightning away from a cluster of aides pinned behind wreckage, the energy conducting harmlessly into the dome wall above them. He worked through the destruction with the relentless, systematic clarity of a man who had spent 3 years learning the difference between heroism and helpfulness, and had decided, tonight, to be the latter. He saved 11 people in 4 minutes. He didn't count them. Counting had always seemed to him like the wrong point of the exercise. Obi-Wan advanced on Palpatine, not running. Walking, the lightning reached for him. The floor cracked beneath his feet where he was standing 3 seconds before he was standing there. A pod suspension system failed and fell through the space he had occupied 4 seconds before that. He moved through all of it the way he had learned, across 19 years of desert wind and silence, to move through the environment's worst, not fighting it, not fleeing from it, but reading it. Placing each step in the space the storm would allow, because the storm, like everything, had a shape. And the shape could be learned, and learned shape could be walked through. Soresu, not as technique, as philosophy, not as defense, as presence. Let nothing touch you that doesn't need to touch you. Be here. Be responsive. Be the stone that the water found its way around, not because the stone fought the water, but because the stone was completely, utterly, and without reservation itself. His blade turned the lightning. Again, again. Each deflection was not a victory. It was maintenance. The ongoing, unheroic work of remaining alive long enough to reach the place he was going. Palpatine looked at him across the ruined floor of the Senate chamber. "You're not afraid," the Sith Lord said. His voice had abandoned the warmth entirely. What remained was simply old, a voice that had been used for too many purposes to have any genuine quality left in it except duration. He didn't stop the storm. He directed it elsewhere, searching for other targets, testing other angles. "After everything I've shown you tonight, after everything you know." Obi-Wan kept walking. "Of you?" He considered the question with the genuine thoughtfulness of a man who had spent a very long time thinking about precisely what frightened him and precisely what didn't. Not any longer. He met Palpatine's gaze across 15 feet of crackling, devastated Senate floor. "What frightens me has always been the idea of failing the people I care about." A pause that carried 19 years of desert in it. "And I didn't fail them tonight." Palpatine sent a wall of force energy that would have thrown a lesser practitioner through the chamber wall. Obi-Wan stepped around it. Not dramatically, not with any display. He read where it was going before it got there, and was already somewhere else when it arrived. Then, Anakin was at his shoulder. There was no transition, no moment of preparation. They were simply as they had always been capable of being, on the rare occasions when everything else was stripped away and only the truth of 20 years together remained. Together, two rhythms synchronized for 2 decades of missions and arguments, and the accumulated, wordless knowledge of how another person moved through the world. Now, finally, with nothing left between them, playing the same tempo. They moved as one thing. Anakin went left. Obi-Wan held center. It was not planned. You could not plan something that emerged from 20 years of knowing another person, knowing how they weighted their footsteps, how they read space, what they reached for when everything else had been eliminated. It simply happened, the way old partnerships happened, the way two people who had been reading each other long enough began to finish each other's sentences without deciding to. Palpatine attacked Anakin with the full weight of his storm, concentrated, focused, the fury of a man directing everything he had at the source of his most personal affront. All the years of investment, all the careful cultivation, the fact that Anakin Skywalker, his chosen one, his decades of patient work, was standing across from him as an adversary was, in a very long life of impossible situations, the most infuriating thing Darth Sidious had ever encountered. The lightning came in one enormous, concentrated surge. Anakin raised his mechanical hand. The lightning hit it. The energy traveled through the arm's conductive architecture, not harmlessly. The servo motors screamed against the overload. The reinforced joint housing heated to dangerous levels, several of the finer motor pathways burning out under the surge. Anakin's face drew tight not only with the specific concentration of someone redirecting something enormous before it could decide where it wanted to go, but with the effort of managing the damage cascading through the arm at the same time. 2 fingers on the mechanical hand locked mid-curl, joints fused by the overload. The arm itself began to lose precision in the forearm assembly. But he held it. He turned it. Not back at Palpatine. Not weaponized. Sideways, into the empty space of the Senate chamber's central column, where it dissipated in a cascade of blue-white light that illuminated the dome for one extraordinary frozen second. When it released, the mechanical hand trembled, not from effort but from damage, the fine motor control partially gone. 2 fingers permanently curled. A mirror. Not a weapon. At a cost. Palpatine looked at his own lightning, redirected, returned as pure energy, stripped of the rage that had given it direction, following the path of least resistance because that was what energy did when you took away the hand that was steering it. Something happened in his face that had not happened in a very long time. Something hesitated. Obi-Wan moved through the hesitation like a hand moving through smoke. He closed the distance without urgency, without announcement, in the same deliberate and unhurried way he had been moving all night, the way of a man who had already been where he was going and was simply allowing his body to arrive. Palpatine turned. Too late. No longer operating on the certainty of a man who had planned for every contingency, but on the instinct of one who had just discovered that the map he had used for decades was wrong in a critical particular. He was still extraordinary, the most powerful dark side practitioner alive, the end product of a tradition 2,000 years in the building. Undimmed by the hour or the vote or anything the evening had cost him. He was not diminished, he was simply outnumbered in a way that had nothing to do with the count of bodies in the room. There was a quality of combat that very few beings ever achieved, and fewer still maintained, fighting without any part of themselves held back. Without the reservation of a man who was also managing fear or pride or the need to be seen as winning. Obi-Wan Kenobi had spent 38 years approaching it. He had spent 19 more years, in the silence and heat of a desert, completing the journey. He had nothing left to prove, no one left to impress. The absence, that total radical freedom from the need for anything beyond the outcome, was the most formidable thing he had ever brought to a fight. He was simply present. Completely, without remainder. The three of them, a Sith Lord and 2 Jedi, moved through the wreckage of the Galactic Senate toward their conclusion. The last senators had reached the exits. The chamber was empty except for them and the fading storm, and the history assembling itself around them in the particular silence that followed things that would be discussed for centuries. Anakin absorbed another surge, reflected it, the damaged hand trembling with the effort, the arm operating on diminished function, one fused finger permanently extended, the forearm servos grinding against the overload they'd already sustained. The lightning, stripped of its rage and returned as pure energy, curved around Palpatine's own defenses, following the path of least resistance, the same path the dark side had always traveled, and this time Palpatine could not entirely deflect it. He staggered. Still standing. Still formidable. Still, in some important and unresolvable sense, one of the most dangerous things in the galaxy. But for the first time in living memory, Darth Sidious was on the back foot. The Force storm faded the way storms faded when they had consumed what fueled them, not in a single moment of ending, but in gradual diminishment, each surge smaller than the one before, until what remained was isolated, weakened bursts scattered across the chamber floor like embers after the fire had made its decision. Palpatine was on his knees. Not from a blow, he had received blows tonight, and had not knelt for any of them. He was on his knees because the Force storm had consumed the enormous reserves of dark side energy that sustained it, and even the most powerful Sith Lord in 2,000 years had limits, and he had reached his. His breath came in measured, controlled draws, the breathing of a man managing pain with technique, the last discipline available to him. His hands, which had produced lightning powerful enough to crack the Senate chamber's walls, rested on the floor in front of him. He looked, in this moment, like what he actually was. An old man. Not the performance of an old man, not the Palpatine, who sometimes chose to appear frail for strategic purposes. The genuine biological article. 65 years of a body that had sustained itself through will and dark side energy for longer than the performance could conceal. Now, with the energy depleted, accounting for the full debt. The lines in his face were not the lines that had been chosen. The weight in his shoulders was not the weight that had been staged. This was what decades of performance finally looked like when the performance stopped. The face beneath the face, older than anyone who had ever stood across from him in this life had ever seen. Obi-Wan stood before him. His lightsaber was in his hand, unignited. Anakin stood 3 steps to his right, his blade also dark, his mechanical arm hanging at an odd angle at the elbow, 2 of the fingers permanently fused from the overload, the forearm trembling faintly with compromised servo function. The Senate chamber extended around them, vast and ruined and quiet in the specific way of rooms that had witnessed something too large for ordinary acoustics. Obi-Wan looked at the man kneeling before him. "You could have been more," he said. Palpatine raised his head. His eyes, pale, clear, the eyes of a genuinely exceptional intelligence that had not diminished. focused on Obi-Wan with the attention of a man who had expected either an ultimatum or a condemnation, and had received, instead, something he didn't have a prepared response for. "You know nothing," Palpatine said, his voice stripped of warmth and performance and every instrument of control, down to the thing that was always underneath them, of what I was. "I know exactly what you were," Obi-Wan said. He said it without heat, the voice of a man reading from a list of things he had spent a long time confirming. The intelligence, the foresight, the patience. He held Palpatine's gaze without flinching from it, the most capable human being in this galaxy. "And you took all of it, all that extraordinary capability, and built with it a machine for suffering. That's the tragedy, Darth Sidious. Not the Republic, not the Jedi. You, what you chose to do with everything you were given." Palpatine's jaw tightened. "The Sith teach that power is the only truth," he said. His voice carried no manipulation now, only the flatness of a conviction so old it had become structural. That everything else, compassion, service, sacrifice, is weakness that stronger beings exploit. "I know," Obi-Wan said. "I understand the logic of it. I even understand why it appealed to someone with your particular history, someone who was always, from the very beginning, looking for the framework that would make sense of a galaxy that didn't treat power with the reverence he believed it deserved." He held Palpatine's gaze. "But the logic is wrong. Not strategically. Fundamentally, power that must eliminate everything else to sustain itself is not strength. It is fear given a more impressive name. A silence." Through the cracks in the dome above them, the lights of Coruscant's aerial traffic moved in their endless patterns, a city of 1,000,000,000 lives going about its business, unaware that the thing that was going to own them was kneeling on a ruined floor. Palpatine reached for his final gambit. The lightning that rose from his right hand was pale, a depleted, thin thread aimed at Anakin's face, with the specific, unsentimentalized cruelty of a man who had lost the war and was choosing to make the loss cost something anyway. Anakin caught it. His mechanical hand intercepted it. The already damaged arm absorbing the surge with a grinding protest of metal, the fused fingers sparking, the forearm assembly losing what little remained of its fine motor function. He didn't move otherwise. He held Palpatine's gaze across the space between them and said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The arm had given what it had to give. Palpatine looked at him. A long look. The look of a man doing a final accounting and arriving, without particular drama, at the result. "You were supposed to be magnificent," he said. "I know," Anakin said. "I'm working on it." Obi-Wan stepped forward. He had thought about this moment. He had thought about it for 19 years in a desert in the long. A cumulative silence of a life stripped of everything except the most essential questions, and he had arrived, through that thinking, at an understanding that was neither comfortable nor dramatic. It was simply clear. He was not acting from rage. Rage was not available to him tonight. Not because he couldn't find it if he looked, but because he had spent 19 years learning to look at things as they actually were, rather than as the emotions around them insisted they must be. He was not acting from revenge. The distinction between justice and revenge had taken him a long time to work out precisely, and he had worked it out, and he knew which one he was doing. He was acting because Sith Lords did not retire. They retreated, recalculated, and returned. They found new angles. The thing kneeling on this floor, if left to the alternatives, would survive to find another angle, and the galaxy would pay the cost of that survival in ways too large to calculate, and he had been given enough information about those costs to know he could not justify allowing them. He was acting because it was necessary. That was all. No ceremony, no speech, no triumph. A necessary thing, done with the gravity of someone who understood the difference between violence and necessity, between anger and decision, and had made peace with all of those distinctions one by one, across 19 years of desert silence. When it was over, Obi-Wan knelt beside Palpatine. He closed the old man's eyes. Anakin watched him do it. The silence that followed had a specific quality, not the silence of relief, not the silence of grief exactly, but the silence of something enormous settling into its final shape. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Why? Because whoever he was before the darkness took him, Obi-Wan's voice was even, looking at the still face with the unhurried attention of a man doing something that deserved to be done deliberately, and there was someone, once, there always is. A pause, and because I want to remember that we did this as something other than his enemies. That we came here because it was right, not because we hated him. That the difference between those two things is the only difference that matters. He rose. We are not what he was. That matters, even when, especially when, the outcome is the same. Anakin looked at him for a long moment. The Senate chamber stretched around them, wrecked and enormous. The architecture of 1,000 years of democratic argument, damaged, but standing. Structural elements settling into new positions with small sounds. The smell of ozone and scorched stone, and something older that was simply the smell of a place where something very large had ended. Through the cracked dome, the sky above Coruscant was beginning to change. The orange glow of the city, unceasing and indifferent, was beginning to be edged at the horizon, where the curvature of the planet city met the dark of space, by the earliest, most tentative suggestion of something else. The very first light of a morning that the Republic would wake into as something different from what it had gone to sleep as. "Is it over?" Anakin asked. Obi-Wan thought about the question. He thought about the desert, not as metaphor but as specific, physical memory, the weight of sand, the movement of twin suns, the way the Force had felt in long evenings when there was nothing to do but receive it. He thought about what it meant to fight for a peace that wasn't a destination, but a practice. He thought about the fact that endings were never complete, that the work didn't stop, that the moment you believed the work was finished was precisely the moment it began to unravel. He thought about what it felt like to watch twin suns set from a meditation rock and understand finally that the sitting and the watching was not exile, but education. "The Sith are gone," he said. "The war is won. The Republic stands." He looked at Anakin. "Everything else is just beginning." He put his hand on Anakin's shoulder, the mechanical one, deliberately, without apology, without the careful navigation around it that had characterized 20 years of Obi-Wan, treating that arm as something to work around rather than part of the man he loved like a brother. Anakin had been carrying the weight of it as shame for long enough. "Go to Padme," he said. "She's waiting." Anakin looked at him. One last look, the look of a man saying something with his eyes that would have taken a long time to say in words, and who understood that this was not the moment for words, and who had, finally, someone he trusted to understand the look without requiring the words. Then he turned and walked, and then he ran, toward the chamber exit, and the sound of his footsteps was the sound of a man with somewhere to be. Obi-Wan stood alone in the ruins of the Senate chamber. The silence was extraordinary. The specific silence of a room that had witnessed something irreversible, and was now, in the absence of the thing that made the noise, simply itself again, an enormous, damaged, ancient room, the air moving through the gaps in the dome carrying the cold of a city that never entirely slept. Then, from somewhere that was not quite behind him and not quite inside him, but occupied the exact space where those two directions became the same direction, a familiar warmth arrived. Unhurried, carrying the quality of a man who had been here all along and was only now choosing to speak. "Well done. Not my Padawan. Not instruction or correction, or the careful language of a teacher managing a student's progress. Just the two words of a man who had witnessed something and was giving that witnessing the acknowledgement it deserved, without qualification or ceremony." Obi-Wan almost smiled. "Not yet," he said quietly to the presence that surrounded him. "There's still a very great deal of work to do. There always is," Qui-Gon said, and the warmth in it was the warmth of a man who considered this a feature rather than a problem. The medical team was concerned. Padme's assigned droids had been noting, with increasing clinical frequency, that the patient was not resting. The patient was not resting because the patient was laughing, actual, genuine laughter, the kind that came from a place that wasn't performing anything, and which the medical team had decided, after some consultation among themselves, to treat as a positive indicator despite its technical deviation from the prescribed rest protocol. Anakin Skywalker arrived 47 minutes after the Senate chamber went quiet. He moved through the building's corridors at the fastest pace achievable, while maintaining the theoretical fiction that he was walking, which is to say, he was not walking. He carried his mechanical arm slightly differently than usual, 2 fingers locked, the forearm responding with a half-second delay. The damage from the night's work visible in the careful way he held it close to his side. He found Padam sitting upright in her medical bed, fully conscious, fully present, already in possession of the situation in the particular way that Padam Amidala was always in possession of every situation she inhabited. He had said, I need to. Padam. I need to. She had said, I know. It's okay. Come here. He had crossed the room and taken her hands, the flesh one and the damaged mechanical one both, because she took both without hesitation, and knelt beside her bed and pressed his forehead against them and simply breathed for a moment, in the shuddering way of a man who had been holding himself together with pure will for several hours, and had found, finally, a place where he didn't have to. She had put her hand on the back of his head. She had waited. Then she had said, "Tell me what happened." He had told her. It took longer than it should have, because he kept needing to stop and collect himself, and she kept very deliberately not commenting on the stopping. Eventually he looked up at her and said, "We have twins. Padam, a boy and a girl." Her face changed in the specific, private way it changed when something had nothing to do with politics or ceremony or the enormous events surrounding them, but was simply and only about itself. "I know," she said. "Obi-Wan told me before I went to the Senate." A pause, with something warm in it. "He said to tell you that he's sorry he didn't know sooner, and that he intends to be the most insufferably present uncle in galactic history." Anakin laughed. It was the first time in a long time, long enough that the sound surprised him slightly, the way you were surprised by a familiar thing encountered after an absence. He had forgotten what it sounded like coming out of him. The twins arrived eventually, with the straightforward efficiency of beings who had already decided they were important and simply needed the rest of the galaxy to catch up. Luke Skywalker made his opinions about the situation known from his first moment, and showed no subsequent sign of revising this approach to existence. Leia, the name would require negotiation, involving both parents and the strong instincts of a small person who already seemed to have a detailed vision for herself, arrived quieter, looking at the new world around her with the expression of someone already taking notes. Anakin held them both. He had not known there was a feeling this large available to human beings. A feeling that combined terror and wonder and the specific physical weight of something small and complete in your arms. He had spent 20 years being afraid of losing people. This, he understood now, was what it felt like to simply have them. The rebuilding of the Jedi Order was not a simple thing. Obi-Wan sat in the Grand Council chamber in the position he had never expected to occupy. Not at the perimeter, not in the chair of a regular council member, but at the center, the Grand Master's position. It had been empty since Yoda departed for Dagobah 3 weeks ago, having declared with characteristic obliqueness that he had something important to learn, that learning it required quiet, and that quiet was available in certain very small swamps in the Outer Rim. Obi-Wan suspected Yoda was fine. He suspected, knowing Yoda, that fine was an understatement, that the ancient master, freed from the weight of an institution that had grown too large and too certain for its own health, was probably having the most productive period of his 900-year life. He would be back when the time was right. He always was. For now, there was work to do. The new students were different from the old ones. Not in kind, they were still children who could feel the Force, still young people who needed guidance in something enormous that demanded responsibility. But the Order receiving them was different in how it received them. Attachment, the word that had been a warning for 1,000 years, was being reconsidered, with the care that reconsidering something fundamental required, towards something more accurate. Connection was not the enemy of wisdom. Grief was not the opposite of service. Being a person, fully and without apology, was not inconsistent with being a Jedi. It was, in fact, the prerequisite. Obi-Wan had written that in the first draft of the new code, and 3 council members had objected. And he had spent an afternoon arguing it, and at the end of the afternoon they had agreed, and it had stayed. He was getting better at having arguments. "You've been thinking," Qui-Gon said. His voice arrived from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, as it always had. Constantly, Obi-Wan agreed. He was sitting in the garden, not meditating, just sitting, which was something he had learned to value in the desert and had not unlearned. "I have the uncomfortable sense there's no shortage of things to think about. There never is." A pause that carried, in Qui-Gon's particular fashion, warm amusement. "How does it feel?" Obi-Wan considered the question as seriously as he considered all of Qui-Gon's questions, even the simple ones. Especially the simple ones. He thought about the council session that morning. He thought about Anakin and Padme and the twins, 3 weeks old, and already appearing to have individual and strongly held opinions about their respective schedules. He thought about Mace Windu, currently leading the effort to reform the Senate's oversight framework and becoming, in 3 weeks, one of the most effective political operators the Republic had ever produced, because it turned out that when you gave Mace Windu a problem instead of an opponent, he was extraordinary. He thought about the clones, freed men, navigating the unprecedented question of what you did with the rest of an accelerated life when the war that defined it was over. "Manageable," he said. He let the words settle. Not simple, not resolved, but manageable. A pause. "I can see the path." Qui-Gon said. The sound of a teacher hearing exactly what he had hoped to hear. "You're going to tell me that the path looking manageable is a warning sign," Obi-Wan said. "That the moment I think I can see it clearly is precisely when I should look at what I'm not seeing." "I wasn't, actually," Qui-Gon said. "I was simply agreeing with you. You can see the path. That's not nothing, Obi-Wan." He was quiet for a moment. Then, he would have been extraordinary. "Anakin, if things had gone the other way." "He is extraordinary," Qui-Gon said. "Right now, in this version of events, exactly as extraordinary as he was always capable of being. A warmth in the voice that had nothing performative in it. The version of him that chose the darkness was also extraordinary. That's the hardest thing to hold sometimes, that the capacity for greatness and the capacity for catastrophe are the same capacity, and what determines which way it goes is very small. Very ordinary. A pause. The difference between a hand extended and a hand withdrawn. "I extended mine," Obi-Wan said. "Yes," Qui-Gon said. "You did." Finally, the wind moved through the rooftop garden. Below, Coruscant went about its enormous, indifferent, ongoing business, a trillion lives carrying their trillion concerns, each person holding their small portion of the vast unfinished project of civilization. Somewhere in the temple below, a young student was working with her first practice saber in one of the training rooms, 7 years old. Recently arrived from Stujon of all places, a small girl with serious eyes and a voice already remarkable for its clarity. Her name was Rowan. She had not been assigned a master yet. She had, however, demonstrated an exceptional facility with the living force that had caught the notice of 3 council members and 1 grandmaster who kept finding reasons to pass by her training sessions. Obi-Wan had not decided anything yet. He was simply observing. He had found, very good at observing. 19 years of practice. The day he returned to Tatooine for the first time, it was by choice, not exile. Not duty, or not primarily duty, though there was duty in it, the small, quiet duty of a man who had learned that he functioned better when he periodically remembered what silence sounded like. He went because he missed the desert. That was the whole of it. He arrived at dusk on purpose. The twin suns were setting when he landed his ship on the rocky plateau above the Lars homestead. The homestead was occupied now by a farming cooperative, a young family who had acquired the land and was making something of it. They waved at the stranger in Jedi robes standing in their upper fields. He waved back. He found the meditation rock without looking for it. It was exactly where he had left it. Rocks, in his experience, tended to be reliable that way. He sat down and watched the suns go down. The sky turned the colors it always turned, the deep amber first, then the red-orange, and just at the horizon where the suns finally passed below it, the brief and extraordinary green that appeared for only a moment before the night took over. He watched it without expectation, without agenda, without the need for it to be anything other than what it was. It was beautiful. It was always beautiful. "I owe you an apology," he said to the air and the sand and the silence. "You tried to tell me something the first time I came here, and I wasn't ready to hear it." He looked out across the dune sea, where the last light was pulling back from the sand in long gold lines. "I'm listening now." The desert was quiet. The first stars appeared, the nearest ones, the familiar ones, the stars that had been the ceiling of 19 years of meditation and grief and the slow, patient practice of becoming more than the sum of what had happened to him. He looked at them the way he had always looked at them from this rock, without urgency, without the need for them to mean anything beyond what they were. From somewhere that was not the desert and not the evening air, but occupied the exact space where all silences connected, Qui-Gon's warmth arrived. It did not speak. It did not need to. Some things, the most important things perhaps, did not require words. They required only presence, the willingness to remain in the same place long enough to receive what was always already there. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Grand Master of the Jedi Order, sat on his rock and watched his desert and breathed, and was, in that breathing, at peace. Not the peace of completion, not the peace of a problem solved or a story ended, the peace of a man who had understood, finally and completely, that the path was the destination, that the journey and the arrival were the same thing, and that what you did with each ordinary moment was, in the end, the only story there was. The sun set. The stars came out. All was well. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.